A world-renowned city of learning, one boasting a thriving market in books.
The first edition market is quite a buoyant one, and in terms of the top-level books, they can be worth a huge amount of money.
And where there's money, there is crime. Amidst the honey-coloured stone and splendour of Oxford, a brutal murder.
Following the discovery of a man's body in Oxford on Thursday the 7th of April, we have launched a murder investigation. Although he hasn't been formally identified, I'm satisfied that that person is a man called Adrian Greenwood, who was 42 years old.
There was a frenzied attack. Greenwood was stabbed multiple times.
And taken from his house, a copy of Wind in the Willows worth £50,000. Bizarrely, the killer pauses as he escapes the scene.
He takes a photo of himself outside the house with blood on his face. I don't know what he was thinking.
He was thinking big and targeting the rich and famous.
Once they start looking at what's on that laptop, they find this Excel spreadsheet hit list, which besides Adrian Greenwood's name, they also find several wealthy celebrities' names, including Kate Moss and Simon Cowell.
Detectives gather evidence until a picture of a suspect emerges. Which piece of the puzzle will reveal Michael Danaher as guilty of murder? What would be a killer's mistake? It's a story which could have been lifted from one of the novels of Colin Dexter and the depictions of his central character Morse in a British TV series. The brutal murder of an author who was part of a closed world in Oxford, one where books are a currency which create wealth, where collectors of all backgrounds will pay what it takes.
Sometimes it's with a view to investment, but more commonly it's the sort of obsessive activity that you often get with collecting.
Undiscovered in family cupboards, garages, on bookshelves and in antique shops, there are rarities worth tens of thousands of pounds. To sell for that much is often about the nuances of what a book has to offer.
Often the value is based on particular attributes. The presence of a dust jacket, the presence of an author's signature, where the author's signature is uncommon, can make a huge difference to the value and add tens of thousands of pounds.
In 2016, Adrian Greenwood was an almost stereotypical product of the Oxford academic world. He had read politics, philosophy and economics at Christ Church College and stayed on in the city. By his early 40s, he was living not far from where he'd been a student. He was a twice-published author, dealt in classic cars and works of art, and had become one of a select few trading in rare books.
Mr. Greenwood is well known in Oxford, and we know that, or we believe that he was running a number of businesses.
He was a collector of historical books, antique books, books of historical interest, first editions, that sort of thing.
Within Oxford, there are only really sort of three or four people at a time in terms of actual dealers with premises or websites and that sort of actual businesses as such. So it's quite a close community, and with that, a fairly competitive community.
Greenwood had become highly considered in the closed book world, good at the hard sell, a natural at uncovering rarities.
Dealing in rare books as opposed to general book selling has different processes that take a large amount of your time. There's a lot of research that goes into both finding the books originally and finding out about the books when you've got them in hand, and you need to be able to catalogue them and turn them into something of interest. A lot of that is storytelling, making the books sound interesting, because if people are going to part with a large amount of money, they want to have a real feel for the book and a sense of value and interest that they can share once they have it as their own possession.
Adrian Greenwood focused on a lucrative speciality.
He specialised mostly in modern first editions and had a line in particular authors such as J.K. Rowling, and fine copies of particularly scarce books. He was somebody that was able to find things that other people couldn't, essentially, which is a large part of the trick.
A trick that Greenwood had pulled off.
Adrian Greenwood had a first edition of a Harry Potter book.
With the J.K. Rowling books, they are a phenomenon in the sense of contemporary authors whose work has almost immediately become collectible in a very high sort of bracket of value. The first book in particular can go for £10,000–20,000 if it's in any sort of good condition.
His discovery of the first edition made the news.
And this was seized upon by the local media and local press, and there was a certain amount of publicity around it, and he was photographed and seen to have this valuable and expensive book.
The first edition was exhibited at a book fair, and then it was stolen. Greenwood warned whoever the thief was that getting rid of it would not be easy.
It would be incredibly difficult to resell a book that had been stolen, because both the community of the book trade is closely knit enough that word would circulate that it would make it impossible to sell to the trade, but also any form of public marketing of the book would attract attention, because the interest in finding those particular titles is so large. They're not going to go unnoticed, and obviously you need them not to go unnoticed if you want to sell them. So the idea that you could then resell the book for anything like its original market value just wouldn't be possible.
Sure enough, the stolen Harry Potter first edition was found abandoned outside an Oxford store and subsequently returned to Adrian Greenwood. That was not his only book of value. He had placed an advert online for a copy of Wind in the Willows with a sale price of just under £50,000. The word was out. Adrian Greenwood had some very valuable books, and at least one person was following the story with a self-serving interest. A man called Michael Danaher.
Michael Danaher was known as the Gentle Giant. He's a large man, very tall, 25 stone or so. He'd worked with his wife at John Lewis in Peterborough, and they had 2 sons. He then left that job and went to work as a manager for an engineering firm. His marriage broke up, but he still maintained contact with his sons, who were at that time sort of 9 and 15 years old, and he saw them at weekends and tried to play his part as their father as best he could in the circumstances.
Michael Danaher, Mr. Ordinary, but one with issues.
Danaher had money problems, serious money problems. He was in debt.
He wouldn't tell his ex-wife or his sons about it, and tried to cope, and tried various means of coping so that he could make life as normal as possible for both himself but also for his sons. And one of the things he did was to look at eBay and find low-value things to buy and then sell on again and make a little bit of money to keep his head above the water. But it wasn't really working, and he was kind of sinking further and further into a sort of morass of debts.
He couldn't see any way out of that, apart from crime.
Not petty crime either. The Gentle Giant wanted to score big. He began researching people to burgle. In early 2016, Danaher trawled the web looking for potential targets. A wealthy donor to a British political party, Adrian Beecroft, was one.
Danaher decided he was a worthy target, and he went and posed as a delivery driver at Beecroft's house in Hampstead. But his wife fought him off, essentially. He tried to push past her, and it was all bungled. And It would have been better for everybody concerned if Danaher had realised at this point this really wasn't his forte, and perhaps his ideas of making money ought to go in a different direction.
The criminal life of Michael Danaher had exposed him as something of an amateur. Still the attentive father at weekends, he was not put off, assiduously researching ways of getting rich quick and illegally.
He effectively found himself a hit list of people that he felt might be vulnerable, might be good targets to yield him a better return than he was getting on buying and selling on eBay. And there were people on that list who were like hedge fund managers and people who weren't known, but there were also celebrities on there who he thought would be vulnerable for some reason to him stealing from them.
TV star and entrepreneur Alan Sugar, model Kate Moss and former footballer Rio Ferdinand were all considered by Danaher as wealthy enough for him to consider breaking into their homes. But Danaher soon decided on an easier target. He remembered the story about the man who dealt in rare books. The two very different worlds of Adrian Greenwood and Michael Danaher were about to collide.
Danaher thinks there's money to be made in second-hand books.
The potential can be 20, 30, 40,000 and up. It's the sort of commodity where if scarcity comes into play and somebody wants it enough, then you're talking X amount.
And one of the people that he clearly discovered during his research on the internet was Adrian Greenwood.
The reason Danaher targeted Adrian Greenwood was because Greenwood had previously appeared in the media talking about the value of rare first edition books, and he thought, I'll get in on this. When Greenwood had appeared in the media, obviously he hadn't really thought about the fact that that would mark him out as a victim. He didn't have security in place. He was just living a normal life in his house in Oxford.
Danaher dug a little deeper. He discovered that Greenwood had valuable books for sale, in particular a first edition of Wind in the Willows, for which Greenwood was asking for £50,000.
Danaher's research also revealed that Adrian Greenwood worked from home. He uncovered precisely where he lived, the Iffley Road in Oxford. The more Danaher read, the more he could dream of what treasures lay inside.
Adrian Greenwood was fairly open about the valuable items that he owned, like this Wind in the Willows book. He'd had publicity, and Danaher had picked up on this. Greenwood really was a victim waiting to happen.
Danaher had already demonstrated that he was no criminal mastermind with his failed attempt at burglary of a family in Hampstead, London.
The stupidity of Michael Danaher is pretty much off the Richter scale.
Undeterred, he now had a new target in mind, the home of a man happy to boast of the valuable books that he had for sale, and who had one in particular on offer. Wind in the Willows, complete with a much vaunted dust jacket.
I can steal that, and maybe some other kind of things. That would bring about the end of my financial worries. He hatched a plan.
He plotted a route from Peterborough in south-central England to Oxford and to the home of Adrian Greenwood. When detectives investigate a case, they're led not by their instincts, but by the evidence they discover. Experienced criminals work hard not to leave a trail. They are wary of digital fingerprints trackable from their online behaviour. Michael Danaher was no criminal mastermind. By the 6th of April, he had left an array of evidence reflecting his plans on his laptop. He'd also made a note next to Greenwood's name in a spreadsheet detailing the pros and cons of potential actions.
He even had a reason column, and the comment against Adrian Greenwood was simply tosser.
Amongst other evidence later found at Danaher's home was a phone, one which had been adapted to work as a stun gun and which Danaher referred to as something he might use.
Danaher really hadn't put a lot of thought into this crime.
On the 6th of April, Danaher drove from Peterborough to Oxford.
Danaher had his target. He may not have known why it was so valuable, but he had seen online that Greenwood was trying to sell a children's book called Wind in the Willows, and he was trumpeting the small but vital attribute that made it very valuable, the one which would tempt collectors into spending big.
The Wind in the Willows is an example of a book that does not normally survive with a dust jacket in terms of what it could sell for. We are talking more like £50,000. Without that, it's, you drop a zero off for the same book. That's the difference that that thin bit of paper wrapping around the book can make.
Danaher drove the 2 hours from his home in Peterborough and arrived in Oxford. April 6th began as a sunny day. Nobody could possibly know that he was on a mission. He travelled on foot from a city centre car park to Iffley Road. As the day went on, the weather changed. Danaher can be seen that day on security footage.
He was captured on CCTV. A local bus captured Danaher on CCTV a couple of times.
As he walks along the Iffley Road, he can be seen checking inside his bag. It's unlikely that passers-by would have considered him worthy of their attention.
He went to Adrian Greenwood's house.
Greenwood didn't have CCTV. He didn't have a state-of-the-art alarm system in his house. All of these things which he very much should have had.
He was disturbed by Mr. Greenwood in the property, and that's where an altercation or fight took place between them.
There was then a frenzied attack. Greenwood was stabbed multiple times. In fact, Danaher stabbed him so hard with a kitchen knife that the handle snapped off the blade. Greenwood stood very little chance.
Adrian Greenwood was stabbed.
We do know that he ended up stabbing him several times, and Adrian Greenwood bled to death.
A seasoned killer would know not to use the sort of knife that Danaher probably picked up from his victim's kitchen. Still, that seems to be what Danaher took.
The knife is a large kitchen knife. It's not an ideal murder weapon. It might seem like one, but it's really not an ideal murder weapon. If you think about what a kitchen knife is designed for, it's designed for slicing and cutting. It's not designed for repeatedly stabbing into somebody. And so if you have a long knife like that, you might think that bodies are easy to stab, but actually getting a knife through the skin is quite difficult. And then it may go into the body okay, but then if it hits bone, it's going to bend again. So if you're repeatedly doing that with this long knife, it will bend. And if it's a cheap knife, the blade may snap off.
Michael Danaher's descent from happily married man and loving father to killer was complete. What he was about to do was finish the job that he had come for.
After he'd killed Adrian Greenwood by stabbing him multiple times, Danaher was looking around for things to steal.
He took Greenwood's wallet and his phone. On his earlier walk along the Iffley Road, Danaher will have seen that Greenwood received no visitors. He may well have felt confident of not being interrupted. He walked throughout the ground and first floor of the house, stepping in the blood of his victim. And then he left. What he did next has few parallels and exposed both a bizarre state of mind and a total absence of understanding how a later investigation might work. The amateur criminal had already made a catalogue of mistakes. His next one is perhaps the most memorable in the case of the murder of the Oxford bookseller. Michael Danaher took out his phone in broad daylight and captured his image.
When he left after 2 hours, he took a selfie outside the property showing himself there.
Danaher, after he'd murdered Greenwood, even took a selfie at Greenwood's house. Well, of course, that photograph contains a lot of metadata that would be able to place Danaher at that house at that time.
A selfie which displayed the blood of Michael Danaher from a cut that he seems to have sustained during the attack.
I don't know what Danaher was thinking taking a selfie of himself with blood on his face, but what he should have known is that one of the first things police do these days when they have a suspect is they seize their mobile phone, they seize their computer records, and they'll go through and they'll look at those things like their photos, the text messages they've sent, the phone calls they've made, and that's all evidence against them.
Danaher did not delete the picture.
He's fresh from killing Greenwood. He's just killed him. He's got his blood on his face. And he takes his photograph. Bizarre behaviour, having just killed somebody.
What kind of murderer takes a selfie of himself at the murder scene?
An amateur murderer, perhaps. Inside the home of Adrian Greenwood, a bloody scene. Danaher had not tried to cover his tracks. In fact, he'd stepped in them. He had not considered the presence of his DNA. Earlier in the day, he'd not bothered to consider the presence of security cameras around the city, or on buses which regularly travelled up the Iffley Road. There are 6 million security cameras at work in Britain at any one time. Experienced criminals know all about them, not Danaher. It was still daylight when Michael Danaher left the home of Adrian Greenwood. He had committed only the second crime of his life. The first had been a failed aggravated burglary and extortion. The second had been theft and murder. Both had been desperate attempts to dig himself out of a debt hole and retain face for his 2 children. But the amateur was simply not equipped to be a criminal. In his bag, he now had the rare copy of Wind in the Willows, the contents of Adrian Greenwood's wallet, and Greenwood's phone, still switched on. He had parked just off the road that he had earlier been seen walking along, and now returned to his Citroën Picasso.
He then gets in his car, still carrying Greenwood's mobile phone, and drives back to Peterborough.
We can tell that he's really got no sense of how he might be caught, what things he might have to take care of to make sure that the police can't follow him, because he takes no steps whatsoever to try to disguise the fact that he has made that journey.
As daily life continued in the busy city of Oxford, no alarm had been raised. The horrific murder had been inside a property at a time when neighbours were not at home. If Adrian Greenwood had screamed for help, he hadn't been heard. Danaher was on his way home, and although the killer had left a trail of evidence, one key mistake would still be needed to alert detectives to look for that evidence in the right places, to consider Danaher as a suspect.
Because Danaher was a pre-physical character, lived 100+ miles away, no connections to the area, it might have been very difficult to find him and connect him into the murder.
To find the selfie, they'd have to find the phone it was taken with. To compare the murder weapon with knives in Danaher's home, they would need good reason to search his home. Before police could uncover who had killed Adrian Greenwood, they would need a lead for them to connect Danaher to that crime. Even if an image of a suspect would emerge from CCTV, there was no match to Danaher's face on the National Criminal Database.
Danaher had no criminal convictions, not even a caution. He was completely off the police radar.
With no witnesses and no link between Greenwood and Danaher in the past, Why would detectives begin to suspect him? There was something else. Adrian Greenwood was not always Mr. Popular. There was a possibility that he had enemies.
By all accounts, he wasn't an easy man to get on with. He'd made a number of enemies, both in his personal and in his business life. There's a number of stories about him, the most interesting of which perhaps is that he once is meant to have held a washing machine installer hostage in his house for a number of hours because he wasn't satisfied that the door on the machine was working properly. Here we have somebody whose life and the way that they're perceived by other people might make you think that there were lots of people who had reason to do him harm or to do him down.
Solving the case of the murder of the Oxford bookworm may not be straightforward. By 4 o'clock on April the 6th, 2016, Adrian Greenwood's death had still not been reported. Michael Danaher had time to get away from the crime scene. He hoped his life could now be turned around. No more debts, some spare money to look after the family. Back in Peterborough, Michael Danaher has returned to the life that he was trying to escape. His was a lonely world. Binge eating. Binge drinking. But he had now taken action and was about to make more mistakes. It was time to cash in on his stolen booty.
He puts that book on eBay.
April 7th, 2016 was a day of showers with extended periods of spring sunshine in Oxford. As throngs of tourists, students and locals came and went and commuters headed to and from work, the body of Adrian Greenwood still lay behind closed doors in the hall of his house. That afternoon, it was discovered.
On the morning of the 7th of April, Mr. Greenwood's young cleaner comes in to clean the house as usual, and she's confronted with this horrific scene of her employer lying dead in the hall in a pool of blood. And she's just completely shocked by this, becomes hysterical, runs into the street, thereby raising the alarm. Passers-by come to see what the commotion is, and one of them's a nurse from the local A&E, and she goes in to try and assist, but of course Adrian Greenwood is long dead.
In the city of fictional crime stories, a real-life murder mystery had begun.
The police arrive. They already know it's a murder scene. One of the first things they're going to be doing is photographing the scene in detail and taking a video to note the position of all the objects and the body. They're going to be taking close-up pictures of the body before they move anything. They're then going to be collecting evidence. So they'll be looking for signs of a struggle.
Police turn up at Adrian Greenwood's house and they start a full forensic examination. They discover that Adrian's phone, wallet and bank cards are missing.
Because Danaher had never committed crimes for which he had been convicted, there was no immediate match between DNA found at the scene and on the national database.
My appeal to the public today is twofold. First of all, anybody that knows Mr. Greenwood, has seen him recently or has had any contact with him, either professionally or personally, and hasn't spoken to the police to make contact with us. We will deal with all information that we receive sensitively. And secondly, you'll see a clip of CCTV on the screen. This CCTV was taken in Sainsbury's in Kidlington in the early evening of Tuesday, the 5th of April, just before 6 o'clock. That's the last sighting that we have of Mr. Greenwood.
Detectives discover that Mr. Greenwood has an occasionally prickly personality. They hear how he locked a delivery man inside his Iffley Road home when angered with the quality of a product. That the world of rare books in which Mr. Greenwood worked saw big money sales. The real reason for the murder soon emerges.
They start looking for a motive, I suppose, and to see if anything's been stolen and if it actually is a a burglary or a robbery, and it becomes apparent that missing from Adrian Greenwood's house is a very rare 108-year-old first edition of The Wind in the Willows. And, you know, this is something which is of great value to collectors.
As investigators collect and collate evidence, no piece of factual data is too small.
It's important that we're able to build a picture of Mr. Greenwood and his lifestyle so that we can carry out the inquiries that we need to carry out in order to find out who's responsible for his death.
As they search the property, they discover that Mr. Greenwood's credit cards are missing, and something else.
It's also discovered that Adrian Greenwood's mobile phone has been stolen too. And not only has it been stolen, but it's not been switched off.
Would this prove to be the killer's mistake, the one which would point detectives in Danaher's direction?
So the phone's communicating with the network for a further 3 hours after he's murdered. And of course, every time it communicates to the network, it betrays its position and where it is.
Even though he's not using Greenwood's phone, that phone is continually signalling to the mobile phone masts that it passes, and police can track where that phone has been and where it ends up.
So the police were able to do cell site analysis. That means they can track that phone's movements.
And from that, pretty quickly, police were able to plot, well, Greenwood's phone has gone from Oxford to Peterborough. And that's a fantastic lead in their investigation because it suddenly narrows down the field of people who could have committed this crime to people who were travelling at that time between Oxford and Peterborough.
Michael Danaher, of course, lived in Peterborough, but at that stage of the inquiry, police knew only that someone had stolen Adrian Greenwood's phone, that he had probably also stolen a rare book, that whoever it was the key suspect in Mr. Greenwood's murder, that he had travelled from Oxford to Peterborough in the hours after the killing. They could still not know that that man was Michael Danaher. He was at home waiting for someone to buy his rare copy of Wind in the Willows on eBay. But the picture was coming together.
The business of not turning off the mobile phone you've stolen again tells us that Danaher was a bit of an amateur at this, really. I think it's pretty common knowledge that mobile phones, when switched on, can be tracked and can be traced.
This was the challenge facing detectives, to sift through security footage featuring multiple thousands of vehicles that had travelled from Oxford's Iffley Road on April 6, 2016, and then on to Peterborough.
From more than 5,000 that they started with, they are able, after a time, to narrow it down to just 20 vehicles. 20 vehicles that went from Oxford to Peterborough in the time frame we're looking at.
Until eventually they found just one car which had followed that same route as Greenwood's mobile phone. That car was a blue Citroën Picasso, and the number plate revealed that it belonged to Danaher.
The noose around his neck was tightening.
Danaher was oblivious. He was still hoping for a big sale of Wind in the Willows, to make a new start. Then came a knock on the door.
All this analysis, which sounds like a mountain of work, the Thames Valley Major Crime Team achieved in just 3 days. And so by the 10th of April, they have their suspect arrested. They've gone 50-year-old Michael Danaher is arrested on suspicion of the murder of Adrian Greenwood.
It had been around 100 hours since Michael Danaher had committed just the second crime of his life. Was he about to pay for it by spending a life behind bars? As Oxford had woken to the news of a bloody murder in the shadow of its world-famous colleges, people living in the city may have expected that a lengthy police inquiry would be needed. In fact, just 4 days after the murder, the police had a man in their sights. Michael Danaher.
When he's arrested, Danaher vehemently denies the allegations. Nothing to do with me, don't know anything about it.
Once Danaher's become a murder suspect, police get a warrant and they go and look in his flat. They find several things which are really, really incriminating. For one thing, they find a pair of boots with blood still on them.
The first thing that police saw when they entered Danaher's home was that there were a pair of bloodied boots on the carpet, on the mat. He hadn't even washed them off, let alone get rid of them.
Those boots had the blood of Adrian Greenwood on them.
Danaher's mistakes are coming home to roost.
They find an absolute treasure trove of evidence.
A stun gun, which is disguised as an iPhone, is not the sort of thing that a law-abiding gentle giant may have in his house, you would think.
So not only did Danaher leave this massive digital footprint, he then kept hold of the book that he's stolen and left it sitting around in his flat.
That enabled them to search eBay records, and indeed Danaher had already listed this first edition of Wind in the Willows on eBay, and they had that record of it.
Yet more evidence is discovered on Danaher's computer.
Once they start looking at what's on that laptop, they find this Excel spreadsheet hit list, which besides Adrian Greenwood's name and the expected take rare books and the modus any, they also find several wealthy celebrities' names, including Kate Moss and Simon Cowell.
He had a list, a hit list, of his intended targets on this madcap scheme he had to go and rob the wealthy to pay his debts off.
Detectives are looking for a match to the knife handle discovered at the crime scene. It doesn't take them long.
They find an envelope containing this broken knife blade, which has Adrian Greenwood's blood still on it.
And of course, that's then able to be physically matched back to the handle that was found at the scene in Adrian Greenwood's house where he was murdered. So the evidence now is mounting up. It's virtually game, set and match. It's such strong and such persuasive evidence.
There is more to come. The evidence that Danaher himself had sent from Iffley Road.
The selfie with the blood still on his face.
That photograph contains data which put Danaher at the scene of the crime, at the time of the crime, and Danaher actually had blood on his face when he took that photograph. It is stupidity beyond compare.
Danaher made a catalogue of errors in his crimes. He had the hit list at home that was easily findable, that showed the amount of premeditation there was. He used his own car. He was completely oblivious to closed-circuit television and automatic number plate recognition when he used that car for that journey.
The search of his flat unearthed amongst the detritus of Danaher's life the book that he thought would change everything.
They found the first edition Wind in the Willows book, the 108-year-old, £50,000 antique book that Danaher was willing to sell on eBay.
The catalogue of mistakes that Danaher had made seemed never-ending.
It's almost as if he was trying to be caught. You couldn't really do much more other than phone the police as soon as you'd finish and say, come and get me. There was a lot of work in this case for the investigation team, and they did it very well and very swiftly. But I have to say it wasn't difficult when someone's making all the errors like Michael Danaher was.
Which of the errors proved to be the turning point which led officers to Danaher's door? Rarely can a murder inquiry have been so led by one piece of compelling evidence to complete the picture of the suspected killer.
Danaher's really fatal mistake was taking Greenwood's phone, because that enabled police to track the journey that the phone travelled on and then narrow down the cars that had similarly travelled that route to pinpoint Danaher.
He kept Adrian Greenwood's mobile phone switched on for 3 hours.
That was like putting a tracker in your pocket. It put him from Greenwood's house back to his apartment. The evidence trail was substantial, it was watertight, it was irrefutable.
They'd never have got to him as a potential suspect if he hadn't have left the phone switched on so they knew to look in Peterborough.
The case against Michael Danaher was compelling, and given the number of mistakes made by the killer, it might be considered as an easy arrest. not necessarily the case.
Even when you're confronted by a frankly quite dumb murderer like Michael Danaher, you have to get the evidence right. You cannot take your foot off the pedal or for a moment be complacent. As much evidence as you may have, you still have to present it properly, thoroughly to the court. You don't want them getting away.
But aside from the forensic and physical evidence, Danaher's own excuses were as weak as the thinking which went into the crime.
When he was asked to explain this hit list spreadsheet at court, Danaher said it was put on his computer by somebody else, a mystery man who he was unwilling to name. Of course, it was just such a ridiculous story that it wasn't believed by the jury, and he was duly convicted of murder. And the aggravating factors of the premeditation and the desire for financial gain from it meant that he was given a recommendation that he should serve 34 years before he was eligible to apply for parole. And not only that, he got another 7-year sentence for possessing the stun gun, because that technically is a firearm, and of course it's a firearm that's prohibited and a serious offence.
The sentences for murder and possession of a stun gun are to run concurrently. When Adrian Greenwood moved as a student to Oxford, he soon learned the value of scarcity. The economics scholar knew how supply and demand worked. If he could find something hard to come by which others wanted, he would benefit. Greenwood was a natural researcher, good at separating the commonplace from those books which would command a high price. He was oblivious to those who would seek a quick win. Men down on their luck, like Michael Danaher. A fantasist and inept killer who left a trail of evidence to prove the case against him, but who might have got away with his crime, but for the rookie mistake of stealing a phone from the scene of a murder and leaving it switched on as he drove all the way home. That was the killer's mistake, which led detectives to the door of Michael Danaher. It was a royal wedding weekend and Britain was enjoying a public holiday. At their home in the English Midlands, a Chinese family, the Dings, joined in the celebrations. They had made Britain their home.
They opened a Chinese medicine shop and they had 3 shops across the UK, and that was quite successful, and that represented that we're doing well financially and that they were quite proud of their businesses.
The Dings had set up a partnership with another Chinese family.
Anxiang and his wife came to this country from China in 1998. They were both doctors of traditional Chinese medicine, and they started a family, and after a short while they met the Dings. She was a businesswoman and he was a lecturer at university in Manchester.
But all was not what it seemed between the couples. The picture-perfect Ding family were about to be killed, one by one. The eldest daughter desperately phoning police for help as her assassin walked towards her.
It was the kind of thing that just makes your blood run cold in your veins. You know, it's that thing where you forget to breathe, where you are chilled throughout your whole body, and you just think, I'm witnessing somebody die a violent death. There's nothing to describe the horror when you know what those screams represent and what those poor children were going through.
Detectives gather evidence until a picture of a suspect emerges. Which piece of the puzzle will reveal Anxiang as guilty of murder? What would be a killer's mistake? The scene, which met officers as they arrived at the home of the Ding family in a quiet English village, was horrific.
My reaction was incredulity, because not so much in the sense that 2 adults had been murdered. I mean, sadly, we all know that happens. I think the ferocity of the attack, the fact that it was a knife-related killing with multiple stab wounds, blood everywhere. But I think the thing that tipped it over the edge for me was the slaying of the 2 girls in the upstairs bedroom. To go and kill 2 defenceless girls cowering in their bedroom in their own home beggars belief.
Xing and Alice Ding, both talented violinists, quite literally knew what was coming. Their attacker had begun with their father.
He confronts Jeff Ding, produces his knife and attacks him. Jeff Ding tries to fight off the attack to ward off the stab wounds, sustains defence wounds to his hands, and Jeff Ding dies of these stab wounds.
The attack was in the kitchen of the house. Jeff Ding's killer had only just begun.
It's believed that Helen Ding hears the commotion in the kitchen and she comes in and immediately attacks her. She has no defence wounds, she hasn't had time to shield herself from the blows, but she's stabbed 13 times down the left side of her body. Fatal blows. He's killed them both, but he's not finished. He then turns his attention to their 2 daughters.
One 18, one just 12, and mercilessly and brutally, in front of each other, stabbed them to death.
Before she died, the oldest Ding daughter managed to use her mobile phone to call the police.
It came to light that there was a telephone call that was made, horrifically enough, from one of the girls who had a mobile phone. So they tried to ring the police, and it went through on the 999 system. But it's what they call a dropped call. So when the emergency operator received the call, they just heard some screams on the end of the phone, and then the call dropped because it ended.
Events elsewhere had an influence on the possibilities of why the call had been made.
It was bank holiday afternoon, so I think there was an element that people thought it was some kind of prank or holiday high spirits. Nevertheless, the police were sent to the location that was indicated from mobile phone tracking that goes with a 999 call, but unfortunately, because of the nature of that tracking, the police were sent to the wrong location. So we know from that phone call, which was received at about just after 3:30 in the afternoon, that was when the murders were taking place, somewhere around the 3:30 mark. But the girls never got to make their request for assistance.
Phone tracking is not an exact science.
So it took the officers to a location at least a mile distant from where the actual murders had occurred. And of course, having turned up and there's nothing here and there doesn't appear to be any problem, would probably, add to this idea that, it's just a prank call. Sadly, the 999 service, fire, ambulance and police do get prank calls. This, chillingly, was not. This was a real call, and those were probably the last human sounds that those 2 poor girls made.
There can be little doubt that the Ding family will have screamed. But neighbours heard nothing. Their home overlooked a landscaped area free from other properties. It's probable that within minutes of Anxiang arriving at the house in Pioneer Close, all 4 had been killed.
The daughters were found upstairs in their bedrooms. One of the daughters was curled up in a ball. And you get stabbed repeatedly, especially in the stomach. It's extremely painful, so maybe she was curled up in a ball because she was in so much pain and she then lost consciousness in that position. Another of the daughters was found in a prayer position.
With all 4 dead, the killer had completed what appeared to be a mission, wiping out an entire family.
What we now know that he did was that, having murdered the family in cold blood, he washed the murder weapon and knife and his hands and left it at the sink. I think the court records will say that he then felt some kind of physical reaction to having committed the murders and actually slept for a while at the house where the murders had been committed.
The slaying of the Ding family was over by 3:30 on the afternoon of Friday, April 29th. 42 hours would pass before their slaughter would be uncovered. Time enough for their killer to be a long way from the scene of their murder. Detectives know that most murders are carried out by someone who knows the victim well. Suspecting someone is, however, a far cry from having the evidence to prove a case. Seasoned investigators tend towards routine when trying to first find and then see a killer convicted. That routine generally starts with getting a phone call. The man who would lead the hunt for the killer of the Ding family is Glyn Timmins. He too was enjoying the royal wedding bank holiday when he heard of their death.
On the night of the 1st of May, when the murders came to light, my colleague was the on-call senior investigating officer for Northamptonshire, and he'd been sent to the discovery of bodies at a house in the Wootton area of Northamptonshire. And because they appeared to be the bodies of 4 family members within their family home, as the senior detective for Northamptonshire, I was put on alert to go and oversee the inquiry.
The family were murdered at their home on Friday the 29th of April last year. The bodies weren't discovered till late Sunday afternoon, early Sunday evening, on the 1st of May.
One step at a time, evidence is gathered. Amongst the first pieces of the picture of a killer to emerge as Timmins and his team began their investigation, the time of death. Friday afternoon. Science provided that information.
When you die, after about 2 hours, between 2 and 4 hours, you get this kind of stiffening of the muscles. It starts off in the face and the neck, in these little muscles, and then it spreads to these bigger muscles. And what's happening is a kind of chemical process in the muscle fibres where they're becoming cross-linked and stiff and rigid. That rigor mortis, that stiffness, will be maintained for about 2 days, after which the muscle fibres begin to disintegrate and then they become floppy again. So you can use the stiffness of different parts of the body to get some sort of estimation of how much time has elapsed.
Establishing time of death was a straightforward enough conclusion for pathologists. For detectives, a range of theories now had to be considered. One immediately occurred to the lead investigator.
Your first reaction is, well, do we have a murder or do we have some kind of murder-suicide, which does happen from time to time.
This, however, was not a case of murder-suicide. That was a theory soon dismissed. For it to be the case, the body of one of the 4 dead would offer no signs of having struggled.
I think we reached that conclusion fairly quickly because of the positions that the victims were found in, and it was clear that there had been a very violent struggle, and both the adult victims had been murdered as opposed to having a struggle between themselves. So it was clear fairly quickly that we were dealing with a third-party murderer.
What about the nationality and culture of the victims? Investigators would learn that revenge, always a possible motive in any murder inquiry, is one which has a long history in Chinese society, where loss of face has been known to lead to vendettas against whole families. Was that what was behind the killer's actions? Was he taking revenge on an entire family for having lost face over something?
In Chinese culture, there is a point where, oh yes, okay, I need to seek revenge in some way because he's done that to me, Ding has done that to me, therefore I need to sort of challenge that. I want him to lose face as well. He needs to do something about this family.
Sunday, May 1st, 2011 fell into two phases for the police. Before the discovery of the bodies, police in Northampton hear of an alert issued to all forces for a missing person, a Chinese national called Anxiang Du. Du was the co-owner of this herbal medicine business in Birmingham, and he had not been heard from since calling into the store on the public holiday 2 days earlier.
We went into the shopping centre and left in the appointments book there a note to his family in Mandarin Chinese, which said things like eternal blessings and were clearly kind of phrases that thought he was not going to see them again.
He left a message for his wife, basically telling her, "Goodbye, I'm going." What he didn't really realise was that his wife would then contact the police to report him missing.
It was on the Saturday, the 30th, she'd gone to the shop that they owned in Birmingham and found what appeared to be a suicide note. In actual fact, when you read the note, it read more as a goodbye note than potentially a suicide note. But as it was, that's how the note was interpreted. And as such, Anxiang Du was circulated by West Midlands Police quite rightly as a vulnerable missing person.
An alert goes to his local police force in the West Midlands saying, "This man has gone missing, he's in an agitated state, we're worried about him." That missing persons alert in the West Midlands will go centrally, so the police in Northampton who are coming across this slaughtered family will also have that information that a man, a Chinese national, has gone missing and is in an agitated state.
A trawl of people who might know Anxiang Du turned up the name of Jeff Ding.
It is quite common for the police to visit known associates of the missing person, and the Ding family were one of the few known associates of Anxiang Du.
So that Sunday morning of May 1st, an officer was sent to the Ding family home in an effort to find out if Mr. Du had been in touch with them.
The police were called that morning to visit the Ding family to see if they'd seen Du, and of course they knocked the door, got no reply early on a Sunday morning, nothing unusual in that, and left a calling card for them to contact the police. Obviously the officers, there is no way they could have known what was inside that quiet suburban house on a quiet, nice estate in a nice part of Northamptonshire.
Outside the house, no car. It was possible they were away. So, with their bodies inside, the officers attending the scene, oblivious to what had happened, left.
It is incredible, and I mean, you know, there are occasions when this inquiry for me was marked more by extraordinary coincidences, missed opportunities, frustrations, barriers, than it was to, you know, normal detective work. I mean, it was literally a case of one step forward, 2 steps back.
Phase 2 of how police viewed events of May 1st, 2011 followed the eventual discovery of the bodies.
A neighbour of the Dings realises she hasn't seen the family about for a day, goes over and peers through the windows of their house and sees the carnage inside.
After the discovery of the bodies and the arrival of murder squad detectives on the case, it seemed too much of a coincidence. A Chinese family slaughtered on the day that a Chinese national who knew them is reported missing. The Dings had owned a Chinese herbal medicine business. Another Chinese national who owned a herbal medicine business was now officially a missing person. Why had the police in Birmingham assumed that the Dings would know anything about Anxiang Du? It turned out that Anxiang Du felt that he had plenty to be resentful about towards Jeff Ding. It wasn't always the case. The Ding and Du families went back a long time after the two women introduced their husbands to each other.
What we know is that Kan Cheng Du and Ji Shui Ding became friends, and as they were becoming friends, their husbands, obviously, they met each other.
Initially they were friends and they went into business together to run a herbal medicine company.
And they in fact opened 3 of these shops, and things were looking good for them.
The then young professionals shared an expertise and worked hard.
And that was quite successful, and that represented that we're doing well financially and that they were quite proud of their businesses. That honour to them was quite what they represented. They can provide for their families, they can enjoy their lifestyle a bit more, because coming from mainland China, I'm sure they would have had quite hardships trying to find jobs, you know, trying to provide for themselves. So when they came over to Britain, this was an opportunity for success, you know, to be able to give their families the lifestyle that they probably didn't have when they were children.
However, disputes soon emerged between the business partners.
That relationship went sour when Anxiang was asked to leave the business by the Dings because of allegations of financial irregularity.
There were no charges, no police involvement, but it was the first hint that something was going wrong. And then 3 years later, in 2004, the Doos were dismissed from the partnership.
Things were to turn ugly. A complex dispute ended up in court.
Do and his wife started legal proceedings against the Dings on the basis they thought they'd been unfairly thrown out of their business partnership.
With the court procedures, at the start, they were quite in favour of the Doos, but as time progressed, the ruling was in favour of the Dings, and that meant for Do it was really spiralling out of control, and there was no hope really for him to go anywhere, to start a business, or you know, just to find the financial means to support his family.
And at the end of that battle, it was the Dings and not the Doos that succeeded.
The feud which had developed between the two families caused Anxiang's bitterness to run deep. He now faced paying £88,000 in legal fees. A complex financial arrangement meant that the house the Dings were now living in was part of the business's assets. Do hoped to sell the house in the village of Wootton, Northamptonshire. It would help him pay off his legal costs. But Do did not actually own it. A court order was issued, preventing Do from trying to sell the house.
Effectively, it froze the assets until the court made its determination, but effectively it meant that Mr. Do had no access to his financial assets, and the sale of his house was prevented.
That order was issued the day before the murders. Detectives had their motive.
Who would want to kill these people? Why would they be killed like this? And because of the legal case and because of the bitterness and the rancour that was around the splitting up of their business, Do would be the obvious suspect.
I mean, clearly the delivery of the court restraining orders the night before had effectively pushed him over the edge in terms of anger, rage, the need to hit back. And I suspect that he spent most of that night thinking about it, ruminating about it, building it up in terms of bile, anger, the need for revenge and retribution. And by the time he went to work on that Friday morning, I'm as convinced as I can be that he had murder in mind, that was his objective.
In any culture, what had happened to Anxiang would cause deep resentment. Some commentators on Chinese culture suggest a violent reaction was all but inevitable.
On one side, you've got the financial difficulties because now he's trying to find another job.
Do had lost this court case. He was in a huge amount of debt.
But more importantly is the loss of face. Obviously, because it's all about pride and how one holds themselves in the Chinese culture. When something turns as sour as that, it's almost as if your whole world has turned upside down.
There was, to Anxiang a lot to be angry about. 2 motive boxes were ticked.
There are a couple of things that come up in murder cases as common motives. One of them is, a big one, is revenge. So, you know, he wanted revenge. It's something like 3% of homicide cases in this country have a financial motive. 40% of them, the motive is it's either an argument or a struggle or it's a revenge attack.
We very quickly were able to examine the background of the association between the Ding family and Anxiang and establish this court battle that had been ongoing. So very, very quickly we were able to pinpoint Du as the likely murder suspect.
Displaying a motive to kill so obviously had betrayed Du as the prime suspect. Police quickly put out appeals for information.
Extensive forensic examination of the scene took place late Sunday and into Monday, the 2nd of May, all day Monday the 2nd of May. This led to us naming Anxiang Du as the prime suspect in this case on Tuesday, the 3rd of May.
The court case which had so enraged Anxiang Du involved a third party, someone who had become involved in the business. Was he now at risk?
We didn't know where this murderer had gone, clearly wasn't still at the scene. And obviously your determination at the outset of any homicide inquiry is to bring the offender to justice, but this was clearly something completely out of the ordinary, if I can use such a term for homicide.
Where was Anxiang Du? What mistake had he made to lead police to him and to prove he was a killer? And would he kill again? Within hours of the discovery of the murdered Ding family, police begin a painstaking trawl through digital evidence. They needed to find him, but also to build a case, and they would uncover plenty of sightings.
The UK is one of the most highly watched places in the world. There's vast numbers of CCTV cameras which have been put up by the police, by local authorities, by private businesses, and increasingly private individuals are installing CCTV cameras. So there's estimated to be more than, I think, somewhere between 4 and 6 million CCTV cameras in the UK.
Police were able to watch step by step Du's activities before the slaughter at Pioneer Close. His mistakes began the moment that he left his home on the day of the murders.
He hadn't really thought through the possibilities as to how he might be caught, because he didn't really take any precautions.
The timeline of movement for Anxiang Du began on the Friday at about 10 o'clock-ish. He drove to Coventry Railway Station.
From Coventry, he bought a ticket to get him to his shop in Birmingham. Cameras gathering information every second. He headed to his store, Natural Care in Birmingham.
It appears that he wasn't in the shop for very long, that he gathered a rucksack and wrote this goodbye note to his wife.
He picks up a bag which contains a knife.
It was the murder weapon.
And within a matter of minutes, left the shop, went to Birmingham New Street and started that fateful journey via train to Northampton, transferring at Northampton to the bus station.
Again, he was captured on camera. The journey from Birmingham to Northampton ended at 12:37. There, he soon found a bus that would take him to Wootton, the village where the Dings lived. On the bus, he appeared perfectly normal to other passengers, just someone else on a bus ride. During the journey, he changed seats. As he alighted, an issue to overcome. He was in the right village, but where was the house?
He doesn't know the area, he gets lost, he asks for directions to a driver, he's given directions but they're wrong as well. So there's quite a bit of toing and froing.
He would arrive at the house around 3 o'clock. The fate of the Ding family was sealed.
The last thing that he expects is his former business partner, is coming uninvited to his house, intent on revenge. But that's what happens. Anxiang Du comes into the kitchen.
Later, Anxiang Du would claim he was met with more provocation.
Ding laughed at Du and called him a fool. That is almost like public shaming. It is, one of the worst things that you can probably do in Chinese culture, because you're shaming them in front of everyone.
He confronts Jeff Ding, produces his knife and attacks him.
Mrs. Ding seems to have been attacked just outside of the kitchen.
Du turns his attention onto her, again stabs her multiple times.
And then he ran upstairs to attack the daughters, who were cowering in a bedroom.
Anxiang went upstairs in that house, found 2 young girls cowering on a bed.
And they're trying to summon help. But Du goes upstairs, finds them, and attacks them both. Stabs them both again, multiple times, again concentrating on the area of the body where he knows the vital organs are, intending to kill them. And he does. He kills both the girls. So within a matter of minutes, he's slain the entire family, mother, father, and both daughters.
The parents' bodies were found hidden behind a curtain downstairs, so they'd obviously been moved. The daughters were found upstairs in their bedrooms. One of the daughters was curled up in a ball.
Du's mind, previously entirely dominated by a lust to kill, now turned to covering his tracks.
Du's quite calm and collected.
Having murdered the family in cold blood, he washed the murder weapon, a knife, and his hands and left it at the sink.
Having first slept after the murders, Du now plots his escape.
What he found was Jeff Ding's wallet and car keys, and decided, well, that's the means by which I'm going to make my escape.
The Ding car, one they had hired, was conspicuous by its absence when a police officer had visited. It was not there because Anxiang had taken it. It seems likely he waited until dark and left Pioneer Close sometime after 8:30 on April 29th. He then headed for a motorway.
The last sighting was at junction 8A of the M40, which is some miles distant of London, so he could have gone pretty much anywhere on that motorway. We were reliant on finding the stolen Vauxhall Corsa.
Du's escape was haphazard but successful. He heads south and gets lucky as he drives into London by using a route where there were no cameras capable of automatic number plate recognition. He went undetected, for now.
The car was abandoned in a side street, this Venables street. And we've got grainy CCTV at about 2:30 in the morning of someone matching Anxiang Du's description, walking along and looking into a shop front as he leaves the car behind.
The illegally parked car gets ticketed again and again and again over 9 days. Du once again got lucky. There is a nationwide hunt for him and for the car that he was driving, but none of the traffic wardens called the vehicle in to be towed away. If they had, it would have alerted police to its whereabouts and given them hope of finding Du.
Incredibly, perhaps, the car is parked in London and tracks 9 parking tickets, but nobody manages to connect the fact that this car is the one that was being used by the wanted man.
This case highlights a flaw in the system. You'd expect that if a car has been parked on a stretch of road and amassed 9 parking tickets over a series of days, that might flag up something to the local authority, that there may be a problem with this car, maybe it's been stolen and abandoned, maybe something has happened to the owner, because otherwise how come they haven't come back and moved their car to stop them getting more parking tickets? That red flag wasn't raised, and maybe if it had, they might have got more information sooner.
The apparent abandon shown by Anxiang meant that the police were getting reports from people who'd seen him on public transport.
We have had over 380 suspect sightings. The majority of those sightings have been in the UK, and all of those sightings are dealt with under a very strict process to make sure we get the optimum from those sightings.
In fact, Anxiang had got lucky for a 3rd time. He boards a ferry for France and is again not spotted.
So he makes that journey across to France. He makes his way down through France into Spain and eventually gets the ferry from Algeciras across to Tangiers.
Anxiang goes off grid in Morocco. He's living there under a false name, getting what work he can.
His luck just keeps on coming.
Once he's in Morocco, Du's actually arrested. He's arrested on suspicion of being there illegally, and he's released. This is only 5 days after the murders, but he's released because he claims his name is Li Ming, that he's from Taiwan, and he's allowed to stay, and he goes on to get a job. He ends up working as a night watchman on a construction site, and he had nowhere to live. He was sleeping sort of rough in the construction site, and some of the other workers kind of took pity on him and would give him food and so forth because they thought his life was so poor, but he was still free. He'd managed to escape.
Du had made a series of mistakes as he had set off to murder his victims. The trail of evidence from his front door to the house where he had killed, together with the clear motive that he had, was likely to get police a conviction. But within weeks of the murders, he was 2,000 miles away, living almost rough, with a new name, a new job, a new life. Police, meanwhile, were ramping up their appeals for help.
The Ding family had been in the UK since about late 1990. Jeff was working at Manchester University as a lecturer. Helen working locally at a school in Northampton, and with the children involved in education in Northampton as well. Since around 2002, both Jeff and Helen had been involved in a civil dispute with the Chinese family over a business issue.
They knew who they were looking for and why he had killed. What would be the mistake to ensure that the police would catch a killer? Detecting who had killed the Ding family had not taken long. Anxiang had hardly tried to cover his tracks.
I think by then, my personal opinion is that he set his mind on a course of action and he was blind to everything else.
In the months which followed the murders, police knew they would need all the help they could get, and they travelled far and wide.
Our visit to China had 3 specific aims. These were to brief the Ministry of Public Security, which are essentially the Chinese police in Beijing, and inform them of the inquiry, the work we've undertaken today, and also to seek their assistance for further inquiries.
Unbeknownst to police, Du's haphazard escape plan had worked. But he was not in China, he was in North Africa, free but facing the indignity of sleeping on a construction site, living on handouts.
I think Du would have found that humiliating, you know, on a makeshift bed and having food parcels, because he's so used to having his business, being able to provide for his family, and his lifestyle has drastically changed, you know, being able to provide for his family, having the means to go out and socialise with people, and for him to be isolated in Morocco, for him to have almost the food parcels given to him and sleeping on the makeshift bed, that's such a different lifestyle for Du that he's just not used to.
He cut an unmistakable figure, and it was this which was to be his undoing. His image had been captured by cameras throughout the English Midlands. It had taken time, but his getaway car had been found in London. It was hard to miss the face of Anxiang Du.
Anxiang Du becomes the most wanted person on the Crime Stoppers website. He's, you know, it's imperative for the police to find him as soon as possible. This is a man who's killed 4 people already, and there's a danger there. He circulates internationally because it's feared that he might have gone abroad.
I have to accept that Anxiang Du may have left the UK. We still look for him within the UK, but he may have left the UK possibly soon after the murders. Someone must have assisted him and is likely to be still assisting him or aware of where he is. I emphasise we've now increased the reward to £25,000, which is a substantial award, and we're looking for that information to come to us directly as the investigation team or through Crime Stoppers.
And that was how Du would be caught. As sightings stopped, it became clear that he'd got out of Britain. His profile, so easy to publicise using the images captured on surveillance, made for headline news and international Crime Stopper programmes.
I should also stress that today we've had no confirmed sightings of Anxiang anywhere in the world. This is one reason why I've fully utilised the Crime Stoppers structure, for example, throughout the UK, Europe and lately North America, to highlight to as wide an audience as possible.
The availability of Do's image made it easier to spread the word.
What he doesn't realise is that Spanish TV has a programme quite similar to Crime Watch in the UK, and they cover the case, and his photo is put onto Spanish TV, and then someone recognises him in Morocco.
In July 2012, so some 14 months after the murders, the man who runs the building site and employs him as night watchman realises that his night watchman is actually Anxiang, the wanted quadruple murderer from the UK. He tells the police. Do is arrested in Morocco when he is finally brought back to the UK and charged with the murder of the 4 members of the Ding family.
Killers who are captured have always made at least one mistake. Do was first reported to police by his own wife, anxious at seeing a note showing Do in despair. Was that his biggest mistake?
The letter was obviously the precursor to Anxiang being treated as what we call a vulnerable missing person. What that did was elevate his status as a missing person to one of a high priority. So the very fact that he was identified as potentially being vulnerable through what appeared to be a suicide threat meant that the police would make immediate active enquiries to trace his whereabouts. And it was those immediate active enquiries to trace his whereabouts that provided the vital link between our murders and the missing person inquiry.
Or was the killer's mistake the trail that he left, which made it easy for detectives to know who the killer was?
I think Do's biggest mistake was not realising the extent of surveillance in this country. Once you become a person of interest, the police can then go back and look at the CCTV footage, and they can find images of you everywhere. There were images of him travelling by train, there were images of him on a bus towards the victim's house. Then once he steals their car, there's the automatic number plate recognition cameras that are picking up where that vehicle is travelling.
Virtually everything he did on the day of the murders and the day after were recorded, and police were able to go back to and piece together his entire route.
Once you become a person of interest, you are watched and there are photos of you everywhere, and it was really those photos and those images which helped convict him.
For lead detective Glyn Timmins, the context of Anxiang murders make him amongst the worst killers that he has come across.
When you talk about evil, you talk about pre-planning, you talk about those elements that somebody has deigned that you were going to die. I don't think it was evil from that point of view, because this was blind rage.
Why had he done it? His argument had been with Jeff Ding and his wife. But surely not the children.
You might wonder why Do killed the whole of the Ding's family and not just Ding himself.
What was more important to him was getting the revenge that he felt was due for the wrong that had been done to him and to his family.
It's really because the way that the Chinese culture works. We talked about losing face in the family name, and for Do, Ding has taken everything away from him. Therefore, Do not only has to kill Ding, but he has to kill everyone associated with the Ding name, so that includes his wife and the 2 children.
Not something a hard-nosed detective finds easy to take.
Nothing will ever reconcile me to the mentality of somebody who goes up to a child's bedroom, finds 2 innocent young people cowering on a bed, having slain their parents. They're in terror, and then that person goes setting about them with a knife, stabbing them repeatedly in front of each other to take their lives. That is malevolent, that is evil. There is no way that I can ever come to terms with that. It just defies every belief I hold dear. It's inconceivable.
In 2013, Anxiang argued in court that he was guilty only of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. He had lost control. His defence was rejected by a jury, and he was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 40 years behind bars. He will be 94 when he is eligible for release.